Hey everybody, and welcome back to Lecture 4 of my course in Philosophy 101 on my channel Philosophy Jam. So today we're going to discuss a variety of ways of answering the skeptic's challenge, or answering skepticism, which again is a series of philosophical views or a variety of philosophical views that claim that great swaths of what we ordinarily take to be knowledge are really not knowledge at all. So we'll go through a variety of answers today, and in the process hopefully learn about some really core philosophical concepts and vocabulary terms that come up really again and again in all of philosophy. So let's begin by recalling Descartes. Okay, René Descartes, famous French philosopher, Enlightenment figure, who is famous for discussing the evil demon scenario and the dreaming scenario, which seem to raise problems for our having any knowledge outside of our own minds, right? It seems like all of our perceptions could be mistaken. They could be generated by a dream or an evil genius. And so therefore it seems like we might not know anything outside of our own minds. But there's something perhaps consoling about this. We can at least, even in these dramatically threatening scenarios, we can know the contents of our minds. We can at least know that we are perceiving certain things. We might even be able to know other things that don't depend on experience or that don't relate to experience. So one thing that Descartes famously thought that we could still know, even in one of these scenarios that threaten skepticism, is we could at least know that we exist, right? In order to be deceived, there needs to be someone who is deceived. In order to have thoughts about being deceived or thoughts about an evil demon, there needs to be someone who has those thoughts. And this is where the famous quote, "I think, therefore I am," comes from. The Latin form of it is cogito ergo sum. Again, meaning I think, therefore I am. Je pense, donc je suis. And what Descartes meant by this is that thinking entails a thinker. There's no way to have thoughts without a thinker. And so one of the firm pieces of knowledge that we could rescue from the threat of skepticism is the fact that I exist. I can directly perceive my thoughts or think my thoughts and deduce that there is a thinker. And so I can rescue my own existence from skepticism. I can know that I exist. I can't do it for you, of course, because I don't have direct access to your thoughts. But you, Descartes thought, could prove it to yourself by thinking and logically deducing from that you exist. So I want to investigate today, I want to start this sort of lecture by investigating a variety of ways in which we might be able to save other knowledge beyond just knowledge of the fact that the thinker exists inside of a skeptical scenario. Perhaps there are other non-experiential ways of arriving at knowledge, certain facts, ways of deducing certain facts that are not threatened by these sorts of skeptical scenarios, like the dreaming hypothesis or the evil demon hypothesis. So let's investigate those. One way that we might start this investigation is by making a distinction that cuts through much of philosophy and introduces a number of vocabulary terms that we should know and that should be addressed in any Philosophy 101 course. So the distinction is between truths that are arrived at or known by experience, so truths about the contents of the room that I'm sitting in, truths about whether the sun will rise tomorrow, truths about the world on the one hand, and truths that can be arrived at on the other hand by pure reason. Truths that can be discovered free of experience. And this kind of distinction is invoked in a number of places throughout philosophy. And there are a number of terms that can be used to describe or categorize what's on either side of it. And I'm going to go through those here quickly because they're really important to nail down for a 101 course. So, on the side of pure reason, we might think that there are the truths of logic. We don't need to go out into the world to investigate logic. We can just know what's true logically by thinking. So, for instance, here, there is the principle of non-contradiction in philosophy. And you might think that this is a truth that can be discovered without any sort of experience at all. It can be discovered, here's the next line, in a perfectly a priori way, meaning it can be discovered free of experience. We can know, just by thinking about it, that an object cannot both be a table and not be a table at the same time. We can know that an object cannot be both a cat and not a cat at the same time. An object cannot be entirely green and entirely red at the same time. So those are truths that can be arrived at or known by way of the principle of non-contradiction. We know that contradictions can exist. And we can discover those truths purely by thinking about them in a purely logical, a priori way, a way that is perfectly removed from experience. All we need is pure reason to arrive at those truths. On the other side of the distinction, we see truths that can be arrived at empirically or in an a posteriori way. These sorts of truths rely on experience in order to be known. So these are truths about the number of planets in the solar system, truths about whether there is a banjo in the room that I currently sit in. Really, any scientific truth is arrived at through experience and observation. So, in order to know these sorts of things, I have to go out into the world and investigate. Now, these are the sorts of truths that seem to be undermined by the possibility of skeptical scenarios. The truths of pure reason, on the other hand, some might think, can be salvaged from the skeptical scenarios. Our knowledge of them doesn't depend on experience. We can use pure reason to arrive at them or to demonstrate them, to know them. Moving to the second half of this table, it's important to recognize that other famous distinctions in philosophy depend on a similar sort of foundation. So Kant famously made a distinction between analytic truths and synthetic truths, right? Or statements that could be known analytically versus statements that can be known synthetically. Analytic statements can be known to be true based on the meanings of the words involved. These are statements that are true by definition, or true because of the way the concepts in the sentence fit together. So a famous example of an analytic truth would be all bachelors are unmarried. This is just conceptually or definitionally true. We don't need to investigate the world here. We don't need any experience in order to discover that all bachelors are unmarried. We can just know by the concepts involved that all bachelors are unmarried, because the definition of a bachelor is an unmarried man. Synthetic truths, on the other hand, are true in virtue of their meanings, like analytic statements, but also, unlike analytic statements, in virtue of the way the world is, and whether the world makes the statement true. So synthetic statements depend on their meanings and on the world in order to be made true, and in order to be discovered to be true. Synthetic truths cannot be known by definition. The sun will rise tomorrow would be a synthetic truth. Most people enjoy Beethoven would be a synthetic truth. In order to know these things, I need to go out into the world and investigate. And a final facet of this distinction between pure reason and experience is the distinction between necessary truths and contingent truths. Necessary truths are thought to be true in all possible worlds. Now, that's a philosopher's way of saying that they could not be false. Necessary truths must be true. 2 + 2 = 4 is a good example. All bachelors are unmarried. These are things that just by their very nature cannot be false. Contingent truths, on the other hand, can be false. The sun will rise tomorrow, of course, could be false. Right? There's nothing that guarantees that the sun will rise tomorrow. Something could happen, sending the earth off on a different trajectory, preventing the sun from rising tomorrow. Now, throughout much of philosophy, it was believed that these sorts of categories align perfectly. That is, empirical truths are a posteriori, they are synthetic, and they are contingent. That is, they could be otherwise, they could be false. Whereas on the other hand, logical truths were thought to be a priori and analytic. They're true in virtue of the concepts involved. They don't require experience to be known. And they were thought to be necessarily true. That is, they could not be false. But more recently in philosophy, the work of Willard Van Orman Quine and Saul Kripke throw these distinctions a bit into doubt. For a 101 class, I'm not going to go into the work of Quine and Kripke. You'd need to take a more advanced philosophy course to see how this sort of distinction might be problematic. In this class, we're going to assume that these are good distinctions and that these sorts of categories line up perfectly. But I invite you to take other classes in order to go a bit more deeply into these really basic and interesting categories. Okay, so now it seems like we have some really good news. All of the stuff on the non-experiential side of this distinction can be potentially saved from the threat of skepticism. That is, it seems like we could save all of the truths and the knowledge that are based on pure reason alone from the various skeptical hypotheses that we've talked about. Let's go through a few examples of how this might be done. So let's look back at the skeptical threat of Hume's problem of induction, which we discussed in the first lecture. Maybe we can solve this problem through a priori reasoning. Maybe there is a way out of it, not based on experience, but through pure reason alone. So Hume claims that if I know the sun will rise tomorrow, then I must have reason to believe the unobserved cases in the future, like tomorrow, will resemble the observed ones of the past, like yesterday. So I have to assume some principle of induction or some kind of uniformity of nature and experience in order to justify my knowledge that the sun will rise tomorrow. Second premise says, I do not have reason to believe the unobserved cases will resemble the observed cases. And it says this for two reasons. One, the unobserved could be very different from the observed, right? There's no logical guarantee that the unobserved will be like the observed. They, of course, could be very different. So it seems like a priori we can't rely on a uniformity of nature. And the second reason premise 2 seems to be correct is that we just can't rely on a principle of induction in order to justify induction. We can't rely on the uniformity of observation to justify the uniformity of observation because that would be arguing in a circle. So the conclusion is therefore I cannot know the sun will rise tomorrow. But there may be an a priori way out of this. It's true that we can't rely on induction, the use of observation or experience, to justify assumptions about the unobserved or the unexperienced, so we can rule out any sort of empirical or a posteriori way out of Hume's problem. But again, maybe there's an a priori way of justifying these kinds of assumptions. While it's true that we can't be a priori justified in believing the unobserved will be like the observed, maybe we can be a priori justified in believing that the observations of things being a certain way gives you good reason to believe that the unobserved will be that way. Perhaps this sort of assumption, that is, an assumption in the uniformity of observation or the uniformity of nature, that is just part of the nature or concept of being reasonable or being rational. So we can, a priori, have reason to believe that the unobserved will be like the observed cases, because that's just part of what it is to be reasonable, to understand the sorts of patterns and the uniform nature of the universe. So that allows us to deny premise 2, allowing us to have reason to believe with good reason that the unobserved cases will be like the observed cases. Okay, this is pretty sweet because now I can rationally believe that the sun will rise tomorrow. And I can believe other similar sorts of predictions about unobserved cases based on past experience. Now I can believe things like, if my cat is currently sleeping, he'll probably continue sleeping for a little bit longer, giving me a break from his annoying, pestering character. Okay, now let's remind ourselves of the alternative hypothesis argument for skepticism. We discussed this in the first lecture as well. Premise 1 says the evidence people have from their experience of the world does not provide better reason to believe ordinary external world propositions and common sense than to believe the rival skeptical hypothesis, such as my being a brain in a vat, a person dreaming, or an evil demon deceiving me. Premise 2. If one's evidence does not provide better reason to believe one hypothesis than to believe some rival hypothesis, then one is not justified in believing that hypothesis. This just seems to be an assertion of evidentialism. Conclusion. people are not justified in believing and thus do not know ordinary external world propositions and common sense. Now, is there an a priori way out of this epistemological nightmare? Indeed there is, and in philosophy it's often called inference to the best explanation, which means that when we have a set of competing hypotheses like this, between common sense, the dream hypothesis, the evil demon hypothesis, and the brain in a vat hypothesis, or the matrix hypothesis, and when the evidence perfectly supports all of these hypotheses equally, we can use inference to the best explanation to arbitrate between them. That is, we can use rules of what makes for a great explanation or a better explanation in order to determine which hypothesis is best. And in this case, you might think that what's simpler and most intuitive is best. That is the common sense hypothesis that there is an external world full of physical objects that are not generated by dreams or evil demons or computer simulations. That seems to be just the simplest way of explaining things, and therefore the best way of explaining things, right? The problem is that there are a variety of objections to this a priori way out of external world skepticism. It's just not really clear what inference to the best explanation means and whether it can be really supported by a priori reason. Here's the problem with inference to the best explanation. It's not clear that simpler is always better. In fact, some conspiracy theories can be extremely unifying and explanatory and even simpler than what occurs in the real world. For instance, it may have been simpler for us just to hoax a lunar landing as opposed to actually building all of the technology that we needed to get to the moon and then going through the hassle of getting there.
There were 6 alleged moon landings between 1969 and 1972, and there's been 0 moon landings since. Seems a little suspicious, doesn't it? Well, that's because we never went to the moon. Let me prove it to you with 13 reasons why the moon landing was fake. Why would America fake the moon landing? Well, at the time, the US was in the heat of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and the space race was important because of the fear that the Soviet Union might weaponize space by putting missile launch sites on the moon, leaving the US defenseless. Now, the US had already been beaten by the Soviet Union in putting the first person into space. They asserted their dominance over us like the dog whisperer putting a hostile rescue dog from Tijuana in its place. But if we could be the first to the moon, then we'd be the new alpha dog in the world. But in this case, what creates the alpha dog isn't the size of the fight in the dog. It's the size of the lie in the dog that's in the fight. Thus, the US became the new alpha dog when we were the first nation to fake the moon landing. The US government also faked the moon landing to distract the public from the Vietnam War, which wasn't very popular. It's like if I'm doing something you disapprove of and I can distract you from it, then you don't notice your disapproval of the thing I'm still doing. Look over there, a moon landing. Now let's look at some hard evidence. The flag waving in the wind. Now take a look at the astronauts proudly planting the American flag on the moon as it gracefully waves in the wind. There's just one problem with this. There's no wind on the moon, Einstein. Evidence of a hoax. No dust kicked up on the lunar landing. Take a close look at the lunar module. You'll see there's no dust on the footpads, and it didn't leave a blast crater either. This would be approximately like diving into a swimming pool in your car and not making a splash. Guess what? The moon's surface is covered in dust. It's not like landing in a Walmart parking lot covered in pavement. So it would be impossible to land on the moon's surface without kicking up a dust storm. No stars in any photos. There are no stars in any photos taken from the moon. Now, were the stars just blotched out by the intense inner city streetlights that are on the moon? Or are there just no stars visible from the pretend moon inside of a Hollywood soundstage? I don't know. I'm just asking questions here.
Anyway, you get the idea. The point is that sometimes conspiracy theories can be simpler than the real theory, the theory that actually explains what happened in the real world. Of course, sometimes they aren't simpler.
I've got two words for you: Stanley Kubrick. He was hired by the government to direct and film the fake moon landing inside a Hollywood soundstage. And he could never tell the truth because if he did, they would kill him, and he knew it. That's why in his 1980 movie, The Shining, he revealed the truth through a trail of secret messages. First, take a look at the kid Danny, who obviously represents Stanley Kubrick himself in the film. He's wearing an Apollo 11 sweater, which tells you Kubrick was Apollo 11. Next, take a look at the scene involving room 237. Room 237 obviously represents the moon because it's approximately 237,000 miles from the Earth. And take a look at the room key. It says room no 237, which means no moon. Plus, if you take the N from the word no, use it to replace the R in the word room, then flip the word backwards, you've got the word moon.
So, simpler may usually be better, but it isn't always better for a hypothesis to be simpler. As we see here, in certain respects, hypothesizing that the lunar landing was a hoax is simpler than actually going through with a lunar landing. But that doesn't make it a good explanation. It's pretty crazy, in fact. So we might not be able to rely on simplicity in order to get out of skepticism. Moreover, it's not clear that the common sense hypothesis, the hypothesis that there is a world of external objects, is simplest in the first place. The dream hypothesis posits far fewer entities than a common sense world full of billions of objects and stars and galaxies and an entire universe. It's not exactly simple. Solipsism seems to win out on grounds of simplicity, since the entire universe would be contained within one mind. Thirdly, simplicity is a non-evidential consideration. It doesn't have to do with the evidence, it has to do with the theory we use to explain the evidence. So it's not clear that if we're good evidentialists, we can accept simplicity as a marker of a good explanation. This, of course, is a point of debate and contention among philosophers. But finally, the most upsetting problem of all for our a priori response to external world skepticism is that it seems like we can't even rescue a priori reason from skeptical scenarios anyway. Can we really assume that an evil demon wouldn't be able to make us think that 2 + 2 = 5, or that squares have more than 4 sides? All of those sorts of things seem to be directly intuited by reason. That is, the truths of mathematics and logic seem on very secure grounds. It seems like we can directly, conceptually, and with pure reason grasp their truthfulness. But it seems like an evil demon could even make us mistake those sorts of things too. So if we can't rely on experience to get us out of skepticism, because that's exactly what skepticism threatens, and if we can't rely on reason based on a priori principles to get us out of skepticism, then what do we do? It seems as though we must learn to live with the absurd. So a variety of philosophers, instead of directly answering skepticism, have advised us about how to live with it. And it's closely related to a problem that Albert Camus, a French existentialist philosopher, brought out in most of his work. His philosophical views were often characterized as affirming the absurdity of life and the human condition. Camus meant by this that humans were constantly searching in the universe for meaning and answers in life, but the universe was not equipped to provide those answers. And so this sort of clash between our fundamental need for meaning in life and the universe's inability to provide that meaning is what makes our life absurd. Thomas Nagel has a slightly different answer in his essay on the absurd. He says that absurdity in life results from our ability to step back and step outside of ourselves cognitively, our ability to transcend our limitations and imagine that everything that we rely on that justifies what we do and how we do it and what we believe and why we believe it, all of those justifications can be called into doubt and questioned. So he says, as I quote here, justifications come to an end when we are content to have them end, when we do not find it necessary to look any further. Even though an evil demon could deceive us on any of our fundamental intuitions, even the ones that we have a priori, and even the ones that seem most supported by reason, it's possible that they be false, since at the end of the day, all of our justifications rely on our feeling justified and nothing more. Wittgenstein, another famous philosopher, invokes a similar point when he said, "If I have exhausted the justifications, I have reached bedrock, and my spade is turned." There's no deeper we can go. Some things we just have to assume as primitive. We have to take certain things for granted and live our lives. David Hume argued that in order to get out of skepticism, we can just rely on human instinct. Instinct is alone enough to pull us out of the skeptical trap and force us to go along with our normal lives. It forces us to take certain assumptions for granted and go about our days. Hume didn't seem to think that we needed to do anything beyond that in order to live with the absurd or to live in light of skepticism. Camus did. He compared our predicament to the predicament of Sisyphus, who was an ancient Greek figure of Greek mythology, who was sentenced to an eternal punishment of rolling a stone or boulder up a mountain. Sisyphus would repeatedly roll this boulder up to the top of the mountain for all of eternity. And it was the god Zeus who was said to have issued this punishment. Camus thinks that this is an apt metaphor for describing the absurdity of our lives and our inability to find intrinsic meaning in a universe that has no meaning. Camus' answer was that we rebel, that we shake our fist at the universe and decide to go on living anyway, that we just invent our own meaning in life and define our own purposes in the world, even though the universe would never give them to us. And in this kind of rebellion and scorn for our fate, we would create our own purpose and meaning in life. Nagel's answer is a bit more modest. He thinks that the problem of skepticism and the problem of the absurd result from really special abilities about us. We're able to recognize the absurdity of life, and we're able to appreciate the threat of skepticism because we are so highly developed creatures. Cognitively, we can do amazing things like transcend ourselves and realize that all of our knowledge could be mistaken. Nagel thought that this was an interesting way of noting our limitations, but also recognizing what made us distinctively human, what separated us from the lower animals, who have no appreciation of absurdity or of skepticism at all. So I'll leave you with that. And as usual, with the discussion questions from today's lecture, which you should prepare for class time. Thanks, everybody, and I hope to see you back for next time on Philosophy Jam.
Oh, how I miss those boardwalks and beaches with taffy and pizza and sweet little darlings.